Commission, formerly chair, now just a member of the commission. We had a peaceful transition of power. But I'm not here representing the Historical Commission or the city. I'm really just here representing myself. And as I said at the start, a couple years ago I gave a pretty straightforward presentation on here are some highlights in the history of race in Melrose. And, you know, Jane, we were talking a couple weeks ago and said, oh no, what will we do for the white people challenging racism idea? And I thought, you know what, the great thing about white people challenging racism is that it's all about moving from talk to action, right? Having a plan for white folks in the community to do something about an issue. And I thought, why not try to do something like that? Something where we can talk about what can the people of this city do to actually make race and the history of race more visible in Melrose moving forward. I then also realized, wow, that is such a big thing to try to accomplish that probably we won't get everybody who we need at this meeting. So what I'm hoping to do this morning is a kind of preliminary investigation of this, and what I'd really be excited to hear is feedback from you. So the plan for this is I'm going to talk about how we got a white history of Melrose, how we have the history that we have now, and then I'm going to just provide some options that I came up with, things that we could do concretely in the community to increase the visibility of the history of people of color in the community. It's not the full list of possible ideas. In fact, I hope you have other ideas as we go through. And part of this was inspired by the fact that I recently completed an online interactive map of the history of Melrose, which you can see a screen grab of it there. It has 680 different items on it if you click on them, and I'll be releasing this to the general public soon as I work out some bugs. If you click on it, you get a picture and a description of each site, and out of those 680 sites I created with this map that is based upon information we've taken in on the Historical Commission for 40 years, only one of them has anything to do with an identifiable person of color. Out of 680 that were collected. Does that mean that there aren't stories there? Yeah, there are, but the white folks who have done research on this, including no doubt myself, just haven't been attentive to that. So I hope to really start a conversation about how to change that this morning. So again, what I want to find out, why is this history invisible? What are the significant aspects that should be made visible? How can we do that? And can we start to talk about a community action plan for doing it? So first of all, how did the white history of Melrose get invented? And I think first it's useful to say that while everybody has a past, not everybody has a history, right? The past is everything that has happened, right, the way I define it, and everybody had a past in this room because stuff happened to you before you came to this room this morning. But your personal history is partly determined by what you think is actually important in your life. So you can choose to ignore certain things. Just to give you an example, here in America, a very common thing is to say, I am a self-made man or woman, and then you tend to ignore any community that gave you support in the past, which is a real problem, of course, with confronting racism. So, what is the history we got? Well, prior to the late 19th century, I would argue this community, in large part, really didn't have a history. There were oral stories that were told from one person to another, but there was no commemoration of the past that took place here. There was no real reflection on it. And then in the 19th century, you get a glut of reflection on what it meant to be Melrose. And there's a reason for that. And it's because a community that had been made up of about 1,200 white farmers and their families, for the most part in that period, suddenly got inundated by thousands upon thousands of immigrants who built houses, changed the landscape of this place, and there was a tremendous sense of loss and of change. And people thought to themselves, well, we better start recording what we're losing so that we don't lose it. And there was a certain hierarchy that was created there in what they thought was actually important. And that commemoration was focused on a very self-consciously white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant vision of the past. So, and here, as you can see, is the population of Melrose. There's 1850, and you see how it skyrockets. And you just don't get a change in the community on that level without some sense of dislocation, and how do I locate myself there and understand what my personal history is. And I would just point to one book as a perfect example of this. If you're not familiar with this book, it is the Bible on early Melrose history. You will find plenty of copies in the library. It's online. It's E.H. Goss's History of Melrose, published in 1902. And it's his summary of everything of significance that happened to that point. And he has a particular hierarchy that he creates. And this hierarchy, I think, is actually reflected in part in our city seal. So this is the city seal of Melrose. And as you can see, there are a bunch of significant dates on our journey to where we are now. What's missing? Certainly.
Native history.
Aha, there you get it. It says that it was explored in 1628, right, as if nobody was there prior to 1628, and it ignores pretty much the 99% of Melrose history that came before. So there's a hierarchy in this seal, and if you look at his table of contents, it actually starts with early exploration, and then territory. It briefly mentions how the land was bought from Native American peoples, but then it goes back to the story of these early white settlers who are given pride of place, who are considered the most important people. And as you look across our city, it's those folks who actually get some representation. So here is a sign for the Ensign Thomas Limehouse. You may notice this if you're ever walking down Main Street from Malden, back and forth near Pine Banks Park, and as it says, he is the first settler in Melrose, right? There's nobody there before. This is the place where it all begins, right? Our only real house that is dedicated to history in the city is the Phineas Upham House, opened to the public in 1913. Really interesting history. There used to be a sign out front that said Phineas Upham, the great Indian fighter, is what it said. And they still have that sign in the attic of the house because he had fought in King Philip's War, for instance. Here you see what for folks who ran the Upham House for many years was the most significant aspect of this house. That this man named James B. Upham, author of the Pledge of Allegiance, although that is actually controversial, there's somebody else who claims to have authored it. It was authored, by the way, in 1892 in honor of Columbus Day, the anniversary in that year. And if you took a tour of the Upham House, pretty much from the 1940s through the 1980s, that's what they would have emphasized, even though this man never actually even lived in that house. But it was very important to create an image of Melrose that was, if you will, quote unquote, all-American, which means all white, right? And that goes back to these early Anglo-Saxon fathers and mothers. Now, just across the border, you'll know this from the end of Howard Street, is the Boardman House. Also an early preserved house. I know this house really well because I've actually worked there on a very part-time basis in the summer for the past 6 years. When that house was bought, it was bought by the organization now known as Historic New England, then known as the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. The call that went out to members of that preservation organization was that the Boardman House is in trouble because there are Italians living in it. And that was just understood that these new immigrants who had come to the country would not possibly understand the significance of this history, and it has to be saved from them. And those tenants were summarily evicted at that point. Now, I would just say that people who grew up in this environment, it had an impact on the way that their vision of America and their vision of the world was, and that was distinctly white. So here is really one of the most significant people in the history of this city, Royal Barry Wills, who grew up on Oakland Street here in Melrose. How many of you have heard the name before? Maybe you do. Yeah, I mean, anybody who knows a little bit about house history, you certainly do. He's one of the most significant architects of the early 20th century, without any question. He was the king of the colonial revival look. So there are other architects of the period, much more avant-garde, who professors of architecture love. He's not one of them. But he grew up in Melrose, and this is his house on Oakland Street that he built, with that center entrance, very similar to other of those old-fashioned houses that you see around town. And this was a fantasy that he marketed all across America that was distinctly comforting and that was distinctly white as well. I think of him as kind of the Thomas Kincaid of architects. Another example is this lady here, graduate of Melrose High School, class of 1926, Miss Mary Elizabeth George, who went on to some fame. Anybody know who she is? I only discovered this recently. If you went to school during a particular period, you might have had to read one of her books for a class, because she will grow up to become Elizabeth George Spear, who wrote the famous The Witch of Blackbird Pond, which is a classic of early American children's novels, and it's also part of this colonial revival. Incidentally, In this book, it is about a girl who moves from Barbados, from a white family, into a little town in Connecticut, and she feels very much not part of the community, and then she gets accused of being a witch. And even though she's from Barbados, there are no black characters in the book, and slavery isn't mentioned. So, but again, this is somebody who came out of this environment that is Melbourne's, right? And all of this, of course, is not having an economic vacuum. Well, this fantasy is being created about the city, that everyone came from good Anglo-Saxon roots, and are very morally virtuous and upstanding for that reason. There is, of course, economic policies that are going on, right, with redlining, to make sure that the people who move here might also be from that background as well. So you can see with the redlining, you see red in Malden, red in Revere down in the corner, meaning that you can't get good low-interest home loans from the federal government down there, but you can get it all through Melrose. So people who are going to move in, of course, those loans are given to white people, so it increases